Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here in New York. So we have a whole series of these events planned across different locations. You guys have I guess maybe it's an honor, a dubious honor, maybe at our premier one. But this is one of our favorite locations. I'm actually kind of a East Coast native myself, so I love coming back to New York. I'm currently based in San Francisco. For those of you who I haven't met, my role as CTO at xMatters really is focused on it's really a market-focused sort of role. So I'm responsible for our product strategy, but I spend the majority of my time actually out with our partners as well as with our customers, helping them in their own digital transformation journeys. I also spend a fair bit of time with other kind of companies in the San Francisco Bay Area and elsewhere on similar sorts of projects and applying them. And really, if you were to leave today with one thing, I'd like you to leave with an idea that says, no matter where you are from a maturity standpoint or what application or business you're in, there are things that we could all do better, and the best way to learn about it is from each other. There's going to be things that you may think are a great idea that someone's gone down that road before and tripped over a few hurdles, and they may be able to help you avoid those sorts of challenges so that you're able to benefit from their experience, and you may get ideas on how to help other people as well. So that's one of the most important things here, is coming out with connections to your peers as you leave this organization. So, there's kind of an old adage that you've probably heard a number of times at this point, where it's actually a little bit of like a TV trope sort of thing, where it's kind of the software is eating the world sort of approach. There's a practical element to this that I think that's kind of an interesting approach. Is we used to talk about software eating the world, then there was like a whole cycle that went around talking about how mobile is going to eat software, and there's always the next wave of technology that now actually seems to come faster and faster that talks about disrupting our industries. The latest one you'll probably hear a lot about is going to be things like AI or machine learning or deep learning as kind of disrupting our industries. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about this is when we view these technologies on their own, there used to be a perspective that said technology was a feature into an application. So if you were an organization that was, let's say, in healthcare or finance, the idea of kind of mobile eating the world used to be viewed as an idea that said, well, I need to add mobile capabilities into what I do today. What's changing, and it's kind of an interesting dynamic shift that we've seen in the marketplace, that these technologies are not becoming features, but are actually reimagining entire businesses. So you've probably heard of, there's some common examples that you hear about all the time, Uber disrupting transportation, Airbnb disrupting the hotel industry, but there's more subtle ones that come into play as well. Things like blockchain modifying how we deal with financials, how we deal with auditable transactions globally. Things that are kind of interesting that come out from a security and privacy perspective. There was a company I was talking to earlier that was looking to just turn the entire world of identity management upside down, not from the perspective of having information live within a company, but having people own their own information. So their view of it was, they said, well, if we can start an approach that says you take all of the personal information that we give away today to Facebook, to Google, to healthcare organizations, and we actually retain them on our own personalized auditable blockchain, and everyone else, a company, becomes your customer. And their view is switch the relationships around entirely. Those sorts of things catching on totally disrupt entire industries. Like the advertising industry no longer owns the data. People own their own data, and you have to give advertisers permission to see specific pieces of information about you. So if you're an organization like that, things change entirely. If you're in the credit rating industry or you provide financial services, how your industry works changes as well. So one of the kind of interesting lessons that we've seen that are kind of nascent but becoming more and more important are that the very fundamentals on which we build our business models are changing. And those things have significant impact to how our businesses themselves run. So if you're in an enterprise today, one of the interesting challenges you have to consider is, how do these technology waves disrupt how we actually do our jobs? And how that works out practically is that we see pressure to evolve very, very quickly within how we do things. And really, this is the approach where we go through and say, we want to go through, whether you work on a service management team, an operations team, an application development team, the rate of change is increasing. The pressure to do more things is increasing. Now, a counterbalance to that is, as organizations adapt, it's also becoming okay to fail more frequently. And it's because experimentation is, in fact, the only way to move at a higher pace. So you go through and say, we're going to try 10 things 10 times as fast, and we're expecting 9 of those to fail. Now, failure is kind of an interesting concept, right? So I started my career at IBM. One of the things that I remember very early from my career, that we were very process focused, and failure was actually not okay. So we had all these systems and processes in place that were designed to produce quality. They were not designed to produce innovation and accelerated rates of learning. So it's kind of an interesting example. If I was to go back to my career and say, if I was to apply the same principles into my roles today or into the larger technology world today, it would in fact be a recipe for disaster. Because what I'd be doing is saying, well, I know the world is going to look like this in a year, and I'm going to march in a straight line towards that, knowing exactly what I'm going to do. And if that's how your organization views applications or services or technology offerings today, that's a very, very high risk enterprise. That approach that used to be safe and warm and kind of said we have a process that we follow through should actually be terrifying, because what it suggests is that there is knowledge of the future. And knowledge of the future is one of those assets that we no longer have. The rate of change in our environment and what technology is able to do upends entire things. I'll give you a really easy example. If I'd said 5 years ago that self-driving cars are going to be something we commonly talk about and start to plan for and we issue state licenses for, most people would have said, you're completely out of your mind, right? There's these weird, odd experiments that were taking place in different kind of technology innovation centers, but they weren't real projects that we had timelines for. So if you planned an automotive business around the fact that this is some crazy experiment, you would effectively be a GM or a Ford today where you're scrambling to make investments in autonomous driving because now it's on the edge of becoming kind of a reality. You can buy cars that can drive themselves on the freeways practically, right? And we see, obviously, there's examples where they don't work out great and sometimes have tragic results. But in fact, it's one of those things that when we look at it from a statistical standpoint, even those sorts of failures are actually acceptable. It sounds kind of ridiculous to say it because it's very, very high watermark set, but for the number of miles driven by autonomous vehicles already, accidents that even cause injuries and sometimes have worse consequences statistically are actually safer than people driving cars already. And those are sorts of disruptions that really change things as far as they go. Now, when we talk about applying this from a practical standpoint, what does this actually mean? One of the approaches that we've seen is organizations moving to highly agile, high velocity approaches within all their various disciplines of technology management. One of the ones that is now actually pretty common is agile development, right? So if you work in any part of your business that does software development, if you don't operate in some sort of agile manner, you're essentially in the minority. That's not going to be something that you're going to find very commonly. There are some applications which follow a waterfall model for development and release, but they're kind of in the minority at this point. Along with that, we also saw transformations that came into play that people would come in and say, we want to be able to manage these applications in the same sort of agile fashion. And the approach there that we started off with was the approach of DevOps, where we said, what if we go through and take some of the learning patterns we see in software development and apply them to the operational nature of how applications are managed? Now, there have been other approaches to this as well. So if you're in the operations world, this isn't the first pass that you've kind of seen of people trying to go through and optimize how we operate technology services. One of the ones that used to be pretty common is people used to talk about things like real-time ops or no ops, or you'll hear things like chat ops, or VR ops. I've heard someone talk about ML ops and AI ops and DevOps, and all of these different themes all really boil down to the same sorts of things. Be more agile and higher velocity in the operating nature of your application. Now, when we actually go out and talk to people about how they're doing along these paths, the results don't quite match up with the experiments. And that's actually to some extent okay. You try out these different models and they vary a great deal. Now, if you look at the categories of how these things work, if you're in an organization and you're still talking a little bit about what is DevOps, you're way behind. Although interestingly, if you look at like the number of articles and things written about DevOps at this point, that is kind of still pretty common, but that's actually pretty old school. For the most part, I think most people realize that DevOps largely is a cultural change, right? The cultural and organizational elements lead everything else. Everything that follows about your operational support actual practices, the real things that you do in terms from a process standpoint, those are actually things that we have some experience with. DevOps actually is about 10 years old. So it's no longer anything new. We've learned about it from companies operating at web scale to operating at enterprise scale and really getting a sense of that. Continuous delivery is also no longer new. In fact, at large web scale companies, it's not unusual to have hundreds of pushes out to production every single day. At enterprises, those numbers are starting to catch up as well. Not to the hundreds of days, but certainly multiple times a week. Those things are the sorts of things that we're starting to catch up with. And from a design and architecture framework, we're seeing how we actually design applications as far as microservices is actually something that's starting to change as well. And then one of the interesting things that comes into this, and this is tied very much to the approach I described earlier about having a focus on quality, is the testing element. So when we talk about encouraging failures, the way you catch failures and not have them become problems in the marketplace is through an appropriate test methodology. And this is something that we do a decent job at on the development side of the house, but operationally, it's actually a much more immature kind of part of it. And in fact, across all the DevOps disciplines, we actually see the testing ability to be one of the more immature ones. And in that framework, one of the things that we found is that there's lessons to be learned from application design as well as from how we actually test applications through canary operations changes to measure things before they fail. That's kind of a newer area and one area that if you do meet some of your peers, talk to them about how they evaluate operational changes at scale in smaller elements to go through and map that the multiple changes don't produce any issues. Now, specifically, one of the things that we got done, how many of you actually read the things like the Puppet State of DevOps survey? So a quick show of hands. See a couple. How many of you read things like Mary Meeker's Internet Trends every year? It's like the 300 slides slideshow. See a couple more hands. There's a fair number of these resources that come out. Actually, I'd say there's a little bit of like survey overload on these things, but there was survey overload, but it didn't quite capture all the areas we wanted to cover. So we actually did a project with Atlassian. So they're the producers of things like Jira, Confluence. If you use any of those sorts of products, they're part of the Atlassian suite. We actually went out and talked to different customers about their experiences in DevOps. And you kind of get a whole range of different things. So operationally, one of the things that we found out was that half of the companies that we talked to from an operational standpoint have a centralized operations teams that detects a major incident. And when we talk about agility, what that means is that they've got a very hierarchical structure for who decides that there's a customer-facing problem. You might be someone who works on an application team, you might be in production support, you could be in an infrastructure support side, but if there's something that you feel impacts customers, you still have to go through many gates before you get to someone who can say, yes, this is a legitimate issue that we should raise to a higher level that requires external focus. This is kind of an interesting area here. For large enterprises, you have kind of brand equity you're trying to protect. So if you work for some of our larger customers, some of our larger financials and healthcare customers, it's a little bit of a risky proposition to have a large body of people be able to push the big red button that says something really bad is happening, raise it on our public-facing website. It's kind of a scary prospect, right? Because you can imagine that shows up on the news, right? If you're a large bank and someone on the development side says, I just pushed out an application release and I think that's going to have production problems, I'm going to push the customer impact button and have it immediately generate an external facing alert, that could well mean that you show up on the news. So you have this interesting balance to figure out what is the level of autonomy that you're going to allow into different places. So it's kind of an interesting challenge to see. It's probably a long conversation on the side, but if you'd like to get into those sorts of who can declare major instance discussions, I'm happy to share some ideas on what I've seen work well. In general, there is a balance. You can't have it too narrowed down to just a small core group of people, but you do need to push it further down towards the people who actually detect those issues early. And actually, one of the interesting challenges we'll see, and this is something that Dan at DealerTrack, they've talked a little bit about as well, who we'll hear from later this morning, is basically talking about seeing issues using the same tools used in production monitoring earlier in the development cycle, to really talk about how do you actually gauge issues that might occur using the same tool set that you use in production, using them in early stages as well. So that's kind of an important concept of having consistency across tools. That's a sign of mature DevOps adoption, is when you have tools that are kind of used consistently across the development lifecycle and the product release lifecycle. One of the other challenges that we see is knowledge sharing. So this is kind of an interesting example, and one of the things that DevOps was designed to go out and solve was how do you actually bridge knowledge across teams. So like I said, I started my career at IBM. One of the things I used to do was field support. I had virtually no knowledge of the information that our engineering teams had of the things that I was supporting out in the field. So I would be, driving around for like 3-4 hours to get to places and working on problems that if I actually got a developer on the phone and I said, man, this problem is really weird. Have you ever seen this before? And they would come back and say, yeah, we've known about that for months. Why do you not know about it? We're like, yeah, thanks. That's very helpful. And I think we all have these issues that as you escalate through, level 2, level 3, level 4 support, eventually get someone who either says, oh yeah, we've totally known about that. Or they're like, oh, I can fix that in 2 seconds. They're like, burp, it's done. And in the meantime, you've got like people that are pulling out their hair for hours on end to go out and do that. So one of the approaches that is an important thing to talk about from a maturity standpoint is effective engagement of the resources that have the answers. And that's really all about capturing knowledge in the aftermath. So how do you actually have a cycle that quickly gets you to people that have the answers, but then captures that information as you move forward as well? And really, one of the approaches we talked about there is the idea of integrations driving how we collaborate. Now, collaboration is kind of an interesting topic in and of itself. So just by a quick show of hands, how many of you have been on conference calls fighting outages or fires when things go wrong? Okay, how many of you, just quick, I'll ask for another raise of hands. How many of you have been on a call that has more than like 20 people on those calls? Okay, so if you read like things like communication theory, about like 10 people is an effective kind of war room sort of exercise. I've actually been on customer calls that have hundreds of people on them. Now imagine like hundreds of people trying to fight a problem. The problem at that point isn't the technology issue that you're trying to deal with, it's the fact that you have 100 people on the call trying to fight this sort of issue, right? And it's completely unwieldy. And what we find is that you have to have a process that connects workflow all through the systems. And in fact, one way of doing this is using the information in our systems to actually be much more targeted about stuff. Because this is kind of like a classical problem that I see, especially in larger enterprises, is with the pressure to solve things more quickly, instead of getting smarter about it, we simply start to say, well, just in case this person can help, let's also bring them in. And all of a sudden, you have these massive groups of people that are not going to be very effective at collaborating together. And in fact, when you get there, half the people tune out. So I've been on these calls, right? You basically hop on the phone, you get the page or some alert shows up, you hop on the conference call, you have it on the speakerphone, you lower the volume till you can barely hear it, and you swivel over and you're doing something else, and then someone's yelling your name because that one time they actually do need you, right? They're like, Abbas, are you there? And then they're like, is Abbas on the call? And then someone's looking at the list of 100 people going, wait, is this sorted by first name or last name? Did Abbas sign in using his nickname? Where is he? Did he not sign in? Is it by email? And then someone is like sending you an instant message saying, hey, they're calling your name. And one of your other friends is texting you saying, hey, you better pay attention to this, right? And in the meantime, you're like, is that another production outage? What's happening right now, right? And we find, in fact, the smarter approach to doing this thing is integrating across our tools to grab the right data. So an effective example of that would be, if you know, if it's an infrastructure issue, have the data available to narrow it down to the teams that deal with the infrastructure. If you're dealing with an application that's just had a release pushed out, find out which are the developers who actually worked on it and have their on-call person engaged on that call. There's lots of different techniques to do that, and the core of it really comes down to utilizing the data across the systems we use. So if you utilize an APM tool, whether it's a New Relic, an AppDynamics, or Dynatrace, or a log management tool like a Splunk, a Sumo Logic, or a logs.io, or your service management system like a Sherwell, a ServiceNow, all the different categories of tools that make up your operational stack, if you actually combine that information in a useful method, you can actually get much, much more targeted about engaging the right people. And in fact, from an operational measurement standpoint, you're better off engaging a smaller group of people and having to bring in people in waves and bringing those people in as you need them than trying to get them all together. In your overall resolution timeline, you're much better off and your outcomes tend to be better. And again, it's kind of its own discussion I'm happy to have in more detail as well. And really the key behind this is using the data from those systems not only to help you with the targeting, but help you with combined sorts of insights. And that insight is a bidirectional sort of street. So it's not just about utilizing the information in your systems. The classical approach to this, by the way, it used to be CMDBs, right? How many of you have been involved in a CMDB project, right? How many of you would be comfortable saying you have a CMDB you can rely on? That you're like, this is the thing. How many of you would comfortably say that? A much smaller group of people, right? So I used to, and actually John and I actually both work with a company. We used to deal with lots of CMDB projects, and it was not uncommon to go through 3-4 generations of these things before people would either entirely give up Or they'd basically just mark the project as complete and say, we've got a CMDB, and wink, wink. Everybody at the higher levels was like, oh yeah, we've totally got a CMDB. You go down to like the manager or director level and below, and everyone's like, that thing's a piece of crap. We don't touch it. We don't look at it. We just kind of check the box. Everyone is happy that we have a CMDB. Let's not do the 5th project, but let's just kind of assume that we have this thing. We have a whole other background mechanism of solving this problem. Just don't tell the management team, because we don't want to do the 5th project. That was literally like a thing I heard. I was like, really? Like, it's a whole like world separation sort of thing. Now, one of the good things is, as applications themselves are getting smarter, as we break them down to microservices, there's a whole new generation of application discovery tools, microservice discovery tools, and ones that actually self-configure. And it's not done because CMDBs are an afterfact, because that was one of the problems with CMDB projects, is you go to the operational team and you'd be like, build me a service map. And you take the development resources and engineering resources, they'd be like, I want no part of this, right? That's an operational concern. You guys go build this on your own. What's changing is that as you go down this path of going through DevOps, one of the things that's important is developers are responsible for their own applications. And guess what happens when you do that? You actually get application maps and self-discovering and self-registering application services that are useful in production resolution. So that's an important pathway. So if that's not a conversation that you guys are having as you go down this kind of DevOps culture thing, it should be, because, and you should point specifically to CMDB and be like, remember that project? Do we want to do that again? No, then let's talk about self-registering applications so we've got better discovery in there to get insights as things take place. So when we actually talk about how practically we resolve these sorts of things, one of the important factors that you've got to think about is, what are the key elements of a system design that has all the right elements to put all these things together? So as you're building together your operational framework, there's a couple of key concerns that you have to keep in mind. One of those is that the centralized, I know where I'm going, step-by-step sort of pathway is just not going to work, right? So in fact, you need to have autonomy, not only for developers, but everyone in the operational stack. But that requires a level of trust. We all have to have a shared contract. So by shared contract, I mean there's no difference between the operational concerns of the organization as far as how you judge success and the building side. So one of the interesting things that I've seen is there used to be a really big difference between operational teams where their success would be judged by things like uptime. They'd be like, hey, we've got like 4 nines of availability on the infrastructure side, and that means that our team is amazing, right? And then you've got an application team that's got release deadlines and velocity as their goals, and no one is thinking about things like, hey, what is the actual customer experience, right? What is so my network's up 4 nines worth of time, my application released on time, and yet my application sucks. The user experience is terrible, the results are no good, it's down all the time, it's throwing crazy errors. That's not a shared contract. One of the things as part of a DevOps cultural transformation is actually having those shared contracts. And one of the elements of that shared contract is autonomy. So a developer who's building an application has the ability to publish their service description into a central archive that says, here's what my application does. An operations team has the ability to go back to a developer and pull them in as they're needed as well. And one of those things that's really important is actually having insights across all those things. That means we have to agree on some common things. What is the definition of our application? What are the agreements on, what are the goals that we have from an operational nature of what we're going to deliver in our system? All those things are kind of a key part of what we do. Another element is you have to think of your tools as shared resources. So it's not okay to have the engineering team working in Jira and having your task management for your operations team in Sherwell or ServiceNow, and those not be shared. So someone who gets an operational alert to say, hey, I've got a systems problem on an application, and they go and diagnose it, they have to have the ability to respond from the notification or in their workflow somewhere to say, add this to the Jira backlog. That's actually like a key little test that you can do. If you as an operational engineer who supports an application and you're theoretically operating kind of a DevOps stance or a shared stance, if you don't have the ability to add something to a Jira backlog, you're not there yet from a maturity standpoint. And the same thing goes the other way. If a developer can't throw something into your ticketing system for an infrastructure queue, you're not quite at the shared resource pool yet. You don't have to be on the same tools, because I think one of the important things is we all have our own frameworks, right? Operational tool, infrastructure operations teams have their kind of view of the world. Service management team has their view of the world. Developers have their own. It's not about using the exact same tools. It's actually enabling movement of data across those tools. And that's a very important consideration as you're building those sorts of things out. And it's one of the hallmarks that I look for, right? If I go into an organization, I can ask a few questions in each of these areas, and I can tell very, very quickly how mature they are and how far they've gone along solving these sorts of issues. The other thing that's really important here is making sure you've got accountability across these sorts of things as well. And accountability isn't about blaming. And that's actually kind of a common thing that we fall into is you get on these, especially on these larger conference calls, you get this, it's a security problem, it's a network problem, no, it's the application guys, this thing should never been pushed out, it's the vendor. It's kind of like, it's kind of these called like blamestorming sessions where you're just like, who can be the most creative at blaming everybody and not taking any responsibility, right? That basically is what the things used to be about. And you could basically build like a scorecard, right? You're like, well, I blame these 4 people, looks like I'm off the hook, right? Everything is great on our team, everyone else sucks, right? And that really isn't a very effective way to do it. The idea here is you have to have shared goals and you measure it that way. And part of this, the culture of not being blamed for failures is actually another really important thing. When I was at IBM, we literally had this as a scorecard. We'd go through and say, how many problems was your team responsible for fixing? And the more you kind of like shunt things off to everybody else, the cleaner you look, right? So you kind of get like this, you show up to work wearing a Teflon suit where you're like, everything just slides off me, untouchable, right? So you have kind of these weird sorts of things where instead of having a shared accountability, the thing that says, if something goes wrong with the application, it doesn't matter. Start on the security side, start on the data side, start on the application team or the web team, doesn't matter. It's our joint service. We share the same goals, right? So if we're not helping each other be better, that doesn't work. And that's why you'll see combinations popping up now, not just like DevOps, but you hear things like DevSecOps, where security teams want to be part of those structures as well. And those are important to encourage to build out shared goals so you do have accountability across the whole framework. And really across all these functions, you have to think about like what are the natural mechanisms to catch these things early. So one of the key highlights there is how do you define an incident, right? So if you follow, how many of you are kind of ITIL adoptees or have some form of ITIL-esque definitions in your organization about things that go wrong? Okay, so incident's kind of an interesting one, right? So what is an incident actually? And one of those things is, and that goes back, if you can't define an incident consistently, it's very difficult that you go back and talk about preventing it overall. So over the last few years, I'd say it's probably, well, let's call it 10 years or so, right? We all, for some reason, got recolonized by the British with the ITIL approach. They kind of snuck it in there. That was their pathway to recolonization, is we all kind of adopted this ITIL thing, right? They started it, they made us do it, and now we're into it. And because of it, it's almost like you're kind of like, hey, we have an incident. Is it really an incident? You kind of reach into your back pocket. You've got a tiny book there. You break out the ITIL handbook. You kind of flip it open. You're like, that is not an incident. I'm out, right? And you kind of like bail. It's not really realistic, right? In fact, an incident is kind of interesting. We've kind of attached this very firm definition for it. But in fact, incidents really are something that needs someone to do something. That effectively is all it is, right? If I'm a developer and I'm working on a release and I basically push a build out and it fails the test cycle, that's an incident. It may not be a customer-facing incident, but it's an incident in my release cycle. In fact, one of the interesting things that we see that works really well is when you start using the same term for across your entire release lifecycle. So that means that incident is no longer a word that the service management team should hold on to and be like, this is my thing. Don't use my word, man. That's my word, right? This is not like a weird like cultural appropriation sort of thing where you're like, other teams shouldn't use the word incident. That's my thing. You want to actually be able to share that, to go through and say, hey, if you're having issues in your world, then it's something that we all kind of have to work on together. And that means that we have to capture this early. And the key behind that is when you start using terms like incident early in your cycle, you get the same mentality of quick response and collaboration. So an incident that happens in the build and test life cycle is the same sort of reaction that you want to have with production. And then everyone kind of gets to the same thing. They're like, hey, we have an incident, it's production, or we have an incident that's release. Use the same sort of terminology. You create a cultural shift that says we handle things that need attention together. And sometimes people like to call them, they don't like the word incidents, they just replace it across the board with anomaly. I think that's kind of a weird one, but you can talk about, you hear about a whole stack of progression. It can go from like anomalies to events to correlations to incidents to major incidents. All those kind of classifications, if you have very distinct processes for dealing with them, you wind up with these silos that you create based on the severity of things that are taking place. And it's almost like you stop paying attention to things you can help with unless they reach the criteria by which you care about it. So I don't listen for events, I listen for major incidents, right? So therefore, if someone's not saying the word major incident, it's an immediate filter. I just don't care, right? And those are sorts of things that you don't want to have. You want to have a culture that naturally encourages the workflow across these systems. So I hope you guys found that useful. What I want to do is just kind of kick that off just to get some ideas floating about how these different sorts of things come together. For the rest of the day, you're going to hear from lots of other speakers who are going to talk about their views, how they've actually gone ahead and implemented these various technologies and approaches. And you'll actually hear some practical examples. I encourage you to kind of ask questions during breaks and stuff, talk to each other. And I think you'll find this a very useful session. And with that, I'll kind of wrap up my bit. I can talk all day if you let me, but I see Sam in the back waving there's like a giant hook that's going to come over at some point. So I'll stop and actually introduce. I'd like to encourage our next speaker to come up. So.